Testing 1 2 1 2. Test 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 test.
All right. So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. We're going to be doing updates in fall prevention. I'm Dr. Cynthia Brown. I'm at UAB and I'm the Division Director for Gerontology, Geriatrics, and Palliative Care there. And I thought I would do something a little bit different. I've given talks here before about fall prevention, but this one is going to be a little bit different, so I hope you'll hold on, and most importantly, I hope you'll learn something along the way. So get comfortable, and you've already seen the objectives, so let's go ahead and move on. So in order to make sure that we're all on the same page, I like to start by defining a fall. And you would think it would be intuitive, but it's surprisingly not. So an international work group, can you imagine they actually got a work group together to actually come up with a definition for a fall? But what they came up with was that this was an event where somebody came to rest on a lower level, whether that was the ground or just a lower level, inadvertently, and as a consequence of anything except the four things that you see listed there. So when somebody actually has a loss of consciousness, or they have a seizure, or they've been hit, that didn't count in their definition as a fall. A Cochrane review found that the most commonly used research definition was something similar, and it was that unintentional coming to rest on the ground, the floor, or another lower level. And they excluded when you lost your balance but caught yourself on the wall or the furniture or another object. But to me, what's most intriguing is what older adults consider a fall. So they did a qualitative study of just shy of 500 older adults. Their average age was 70, and they were asked, how would you describe or define a fall? And most commonly, what older adults talked about was motor control issues. So they slipped, they tripped, they stumbled, and then they lost their balance. They talked about injury, and they talked about obstacles that might have been in their way that created the environment that caused them to fall. So it was the dog, it was they tripped over the curb, whatever. But the important point is that seniors tended to associate falls with what happened right before and the consequences, whereas research people tend to focus on a description of the event. And that's just important from a clinical perspective as we think about asking older adults if they have sustained a fall, because they may not be defining it the same way as what we're reading in our research journals and the like. So how important are falls? Obviously, we think they're important, or we wouldn't be standing here talking and you wouldn't be listening. But I want to give you some epidemiology about falls and the scope of falls as a problem. So this first map actually is global fall-related mortality. So you can see, and where's my little, there it is. So the lowest number of falls per 100,000 is the green, and when you get up to red, that's the highest number of falls per 100,000. And you can see that Europe and the Scandinavian countries have the highest. We are next, along with all of Russia, China, etc. in this area, and Australia. The point being, falls are extremely common across the country, and places where the population tends to be younger, it's less of a problem, like India and Africa. So what is going on in our country? So if you haven't heard, there's a baby boom. And that baby boom happened 65 plus years ago, and we are all turning 65. So the current number is that over the next 18 years, every day, there will be 10,000 older adults who turn 65. So we're talking about a huge number of older adults, and they are more at risk of all the adverse outcomes associated with falls. You can also see that our population of 85 and older folks is also increasing, and they're at particularly high risk. So in our communities, we know that about 1/3 of older adults are going to fall each year. And less than half of those folks talk to their healthcare providers about the fact that they've had a fall. And oftentimes, half the cases are recurrent. So people aren't just falling once and moving on, but they're actually falling several times. We know that rates increase as we get older. And the other interesting time that the rates increase is in that month after hospital discharge. The thought is that it has to do with the fact that they've been ill, certainly, but also that when you come into our hospitals, we tend to not let you up out of bed very much, and so there's deconditioning that occurs during hospitalization. We also know that falls morbidity is very common in the community, and some of these statistics might stun you. That in the next 17 seconds, an older adult is going to be treated in somebody's hospital emergency department for a fall-related injury. That anywhere between 10 and 15% of these falls will result in an injury that requires medical attention. When we're talking about the nursing home population, that number escalates to 25 to 30% of those folks, if they fall, will require some sort of medical attention. And it is the leading cause of injury-related visits to an emergency department. So if someone's going to have some sort of injury for older adults, it's a fall. For younger adults, it's motor vehicle accidents. And there were 2.4 million non-fatal fall injuries that were treated in emergency departments across the country. And this slide shows you the national estimates of the 10 leading causes of non-fatal injuries that are treated in our emergency departments. And 2017 is the latest of the statistics available, but you can see in the 65 and older crew, there's about 3 million older adults who are seen for non-fatal injuries. And interestingly, it actually is the highest across all age groups, with the exception of that 10 to 14 and 15 to 24 age group. And in that case, it's unintentionally being struck by or against another object. So it's not that falls don't happen and that injuries don't happen in younger people. It's just that the consequences are not so obvious, and so we tend not to think about them. So particularly for my trauma nurses, these slides are for you. Let's talk about the injuries that are associated with falls. So number one, which might surprise you, are spinal cord injuries. So a fascinating statistic is that the average age at injury has moved from young people, 29 used to be the average age for a spinal cord injury, to 42 years of age in 2015. Now that's not that somehow middle-aged folks or young middle-aged, depending on what you are, have suddenly started having spinal cord injuries, but rather that we're seeing a lot more older adults who are pulling that average up in that direction. In terms of causes, the causes have changed drastically since 2010 as well. So you can see that vehicular are these in this bar, so they're still the most common, but falls are number 2 in terms of reasons, with violence, sports, med-surg issues, and other capturing the rest of the reasons for spinal cord injuries. And in terms of folks who are over the age of 65 years, 41.5% of traumatic spinal cord injuries are caused by falls. So that's a huge number. And you can see in this particular graph that when we look at those who are over the age of 65, their cumulative incidence, which is what's going on here, has increased from 2007 to 8 to 9, and one would estimate that that will continue to be a problem as we see the population aging. Unfortunately, older adults usually do not do very well after a spinal cord injury, so their mortality in the emergency department is quite high, and their adjusted odds of dying are 4 times that of younger adults. Their mortality during the hospitalization is also significantly high, so even if they make it through surgery, stabilization, they may not survive the hospitalization and are almost 6 times more likely to die during the hospitalization. And then they're almost 4 times more likely to end up being discharged to chronic care or to a nursing home after their spinal cord injury. But spinal cord injuries aren't the only things that happen when people fall, particularly older adults. So another injury associated with falls is traumatic brain injury. And again, amazingly, falls are the leading cause of traumatic brain injury in the US. They cause 40% of our TBIs. And I don't know about you, but I work in the Birmingham VA, and so I always think about IEDs as the major cause, but no, it's people falling down the stairs, off a curb, and striking their heads. Among those who are over the age of 65, falls are the cause for 81% of their traumatic brain injuries. And again, you've undoubtedly seen that if you've been out in practice where folks end up with subdural hematomas and the like, and it can be a pretty insignificant bump to end up causing some sort of a traumatic brain injury. The rates of hospitalization and death are seen in those who are over the age of 75 years. And you can see that in terms of death, it's 57 per 100,000 TBI-related hospitalizations. And unfortunately for men, the TBI rates tend to be higher for men compared with women, and that's true across the spectrum, so it doesn't matter what age, but that's just a general tendency. I think it has to do with the risky behaviors, guys. So here are some of the leading causes of traumatic brain injury, and you can appreciate that it's almost 41% for falls. Things like being struck by or against an object, motor vehicles, and assaults take up another huge chunk in terms of reasons for folks to have traumatic brain injuries. And here, this slide shows you the traumatic brain injury related emergency department visits. So you can see we've got 0 to 4-year-olds all the way up to those who are over the age of 65. And you can also see that in young and in older adults that falls are clearly the #1 reason for that TBI related ED visit. In the middle, falls clearly are still important, but there are other things in particular that struck by or against becomes more important in that middle group. And this slide shows you the TBI-related deaths by age group. And so again, not surprisingly, that pink one up at the top there, that's the older adults. And they are significantly more likely to die of their traumatic brain injury in comparison to those that are younger. But notice that they all, have deaths associated with them. And so just because we're focused on older adults, I do want you to recognize that young and middle-aged folks also are at risk of death because of their traumatic brain injury. So spinal cord injury, traumatic brain injury, those may not have been things that you've actually thought about with regard to falls, but this next one, absolutely, hands down, you'll all say, oh yeah, that's what I think of. And it's hip fractures. So when older adults are worried about falling, this is what they're most concerned about, interestingly enough. They do recognize that they need to protect their heads, and will tell you that, but they also know somebody who fell, broke a hip, and never got to come back and live in their home again, that they ended up in a nursing home, or worse, they died. So we know that there are over 250,000 hospital admissions every year for hip fractures, and that number is expected to escalate over time as we see our population age. More than 95% of the hip fractures are caused by falling. I typically will get a question, so I'm going to preempt it now, about what comes first. Do people have some sort of a pathologic fracture that puts them on the floor, or does the fall actually do the trick? And the answer is there will never be a complete way of knowing that answer, because there certainly are people with pathologic fractures who fall after their hip breaks, but the majority of falls are thought to be they fall, the impact of the fall is enough to cause a fracture, and that these are people who, while they may have had somewhat weakened bones, the bones were not weak enough to just fracture on their own during ambulation or movement. The usual is people falling over sideways and landing on their hip. And unfortunately for women, we end up sustaining about 3/4 of all the fractures, although our male counterparts absolutely do fracture. So we do need to keep our men in mind after a fall. We know that bone density matters, and so white women are more likely to end up with a hip fracture than our African American or Asian women, and it's related to bone density over time. And as we age, we also know that folks are significantly more likely to have a hip fracture compared to younger elders. So if you make it to 85 years of age, and this is whether you're male or female, you are more likely to sustain a hip fracture. Unfortunately, folks who do sustain a hip fracture oftentimes end up remaining in the nursing home for at least a year after their injury, and for many they never leave the nursing home because they just need a higher level of care that then can be provided in their own home. And a large proportion of the fall-related deaths are due to complications that happen after hip fractures. So we talk about 1 in 5 folks who fall and fracture their hip will actually not be around the next year. Again, it's not typically the hip fracture itself or surgery or anything related to it, but it's the fact that they're less mobile, they become frailer, they're more likely to develop other things that then end up causing them to die. It's also a marker of someone who's not doing well, And so it isn't a surprise that we see this big number of folks who don't survive. The other thing to think about are all the other fractures that can happen. So we don't do a whole lot of talking about vertebral fractures, but absolutely, if you've seen them in clinic, you know they can be incredibly painful and debilitating for people who are suffering through them. Wrist fractures, distal forearm fractures, when people fall and try and catch themselves, the classic Colles fracture, are all very common fractures associated with falls. And you can see in this slide the age ranges from 50 up to more than 85 years of age, and that over time all of these fractures increase in numbers per 10,000 per year. And you can see that women have way more fractures across the board, but men absolutely do. And appreciate right here, there's this sort of break point at 80 to 84, where men start to actually really increase in the number of hip fractures that are seen. Thought there is that men can develop osteopenia and osteoporosis. It just takes them a lot longer than it takes our women, and so over time they can start having some of the same risk factors that our older women have. And if we look at leading causes of injury deaths by age group, I want to again point out that unintentional falls is number one in the 65 and older group. So if we took out falls, we could reduce the number of injury-related deaths by 35,000 plus. And this is just to show you that the death rate does continue to escalate. It's not that we're doing a worse job, it's just that there's a lot more in the population who are at risk. And so we're seeing this with both men and women over time. So beyond thinking about the medical complications and the impact on older adults and older adults' families, etc., the other thing we have to think about is the cost from a community societal perspective of falls. The last numbers that were run were in 2013, and it was estimated that the direct medical costs were $34 billion, yes, billion dollars, that we are spending on falls and fall-related injuries and things that are reimbursed by Medicare. And you can see this breakdown of what the direct medical costs actually are. The majority, not surprisingly, is the hospitalization, but there's significant cost associated with home health care and emergency room visits and the office visits, coming back to see physicians, etc. So clearly, a lot of our resources are being focused on addressing this after the fact. And unfortunately, falls are one of the most expensive medical conditions that older adults have, which is really quite striking when you think about diabetes and hypertension and even cancer, and think of the cost associated. And you can appreciate the direct medical costs for both fatal and non-fatal injuries. Not surprisingly, the non-fatal injuries are significantly higher than the fatal ones. And again, I'll have you flash back to the fact that if you have an injury that is going to be fatal, chances are you won't make it out of the hospital. You'll either pass in the emergency department, or it may be that you die during the hospitalization, so it's less expensive. you can also see that that cost continues to go up, and over the 3 years that it was tracked in this particular study, it went up by $1 billion. On average, it's costing about $30,000 for a hospitalization for a fall injury. And again, not surprisingly, our women are more expensive than our men, and this slide just shows that to you. So in the younger old crew, the men are more expensive. As you can see, the men are in that yellowish bar, the women are in the red. When we get to the 80, 84, women start edging the guys out. When we get 85 and older, the women are costing significantly more. Part of that is in geriatrics, we talk about the fact that men die, women become disabled. And so we're more likely to be around to have disability, including falls, hip fractures, and the like. So just to sort of think about all of the costs associated with these different injuries, in 2000, which is the last time this data, somebody ran it, 78% of fall deaths, 79% of total costs were due to traumatic brain injuries and essentially hip fractures. And 28% of the fall deaths and 29% of the costs were because of some sort of internal injury to internal organs after a fall. Fractures are most common and costly. That's not a surprise. But just over 1/3 of the non-fatal injuries were fractures, but they cost a whole lot more. So they were 61% of the total non-fatal costs. So those hip fractures and the like, from a societal perspective, are really expensive. The other thing that is intriguing is that this doesn't account for a whole lot of costs that don't get rolled into Medicare and the like. So the disability that people experience, the fact that they're dependent on others, the fact that either spouses or children may actually have to care for the older adult and not be able to work or not be able to do other household duties because they're caring for an older adult. And then there's the reduced quality of life. And while there are ways to try and capture loss in quality of life, that's certainly individual and not something that's captured by dollars. So what are the risk factors? This has actually been the focus of the majority of the research that's been done, particularly in the early years. And what we know, kind of like everything else with older adults, is that falls tend to be multifactorial. So it's pretty rare for you to have someone who has just one reason to fall and that they fall. That's not the norm. It's usually that they have a number of risk factors, they get to a certain point where it tips them over, and they're a lot more likely to fall. And we know as the number of risk factors increases, so does that risk of falls. So Mary Tinetti, early on in her career, looked at number of risk factors, and I'm going to share those in a minute as to what risk factors you ought to be thinking about as you're looking at older adults that you're caring for. And she was able to show that if you don't have any risk factors, you still have about an 8% chance that you're going to fall in the next year. And you can imagine that's the unusual circumstance. There's water on the ground. I have a great story about leaving Grand Rounds at Yale, coming outside in my white coat. I hit a patch of leaves, my legs flew up, I flew down. I looked around real quick to see who saw me. And the street that was there, a gentleman was driving down the street at the time. He rolls his window down and yells, "Doc, are you okay?" I was mortified, but clearly I didn't have any risk factors. I was, 30 years old and in great shape at the time. But as we see people get older, they tend to accrue risk factors. And you can see when you get to 4 or more, you've got a 78% chance of falling in the next year. And here are some of the most common risk factors that we think about. And if you know anyone who takes care of older adults, we tend to not think disease specific. So you'll notice that these are broad categories of things that happen to people. So muscle weakness, #1 risk factor, 4 times more likely to fall if you're weak than if you're strong. Why would you be weak? There's lots of reasons, right? So older adults develop sarcopenia or muscle-related atrophy due to aging. It may be that they're deconditioned from coming out of the hospital. It may be that they have some sort of disease that limits their ability to be mobile. They have bad COPD, so they can't get around very well. Having had a history of falls predicts who's going to fall again, so no surprise there. Having problems with your gait or your balance, not being able to see, and certainly cognitive impairment all play into your risk for falling. And what this table shows you is the number of studies, randomized control studies, that looked at these risk factors and for whom it was significant. So in 10 of the 11 studies where they looked at muscle weakness, it was significant as a risk factor for falls. And you can see 4 times more likely if you're weak than if you're strong. What about medicines? So I just had a gentleman in my fall prevention clinic who this was the problem hands down. He was orthostatic. He was on 4 or 5 different medications that affected his blood pressure, had been pulled off of a couple and was already feeling better. So, he was a slam dunk in terms of, I think he's going to do really well because his other risk factors are pretty minimal. But you can appreciate that there are a number of medicines that are associated with falls. And in older adults, it's anything that's psychotropic can put you at a higher risk. Now, I want to point out, as an example, antidepressants. If someone is depressed, they're more likely to fall. If someone is on antidepressants, they're more likely to fall. So clearly, one of the important things as we're looking at people's medications is to weigh risk and benefit of those medications. So we don't want to go through somebody's medication list and just pull things off because they've been associated with falls. We really want to think about what am I getting out of this medication and what are the risks of it and which way do I want to go? Because clearly I am not going to take someone who's depressed off their antidepressant even if they're falling. There's always a lot of interest in where people fall, and so I found this to be a really interesting global report about the epidemiology of falls. So more than half the falls happen outside the home, and almost a quarter, or a little over a quarter, happen when people are just walking on a level surface. The ones that worry me are these up here. Why are you climbing on chairs and ladders if you're an older adult, right? But 3% of the falls, that's where they happen. Another big one that we worry about in terms of injury, as we talked about earlier, is folks who fall on the stairs. And 6% of all falls happen on the stairs. So there have been a lot of different strategies to try and address falls and figure out how do we reduce them. We're not doing real well on that, I can tell you. In terms of evidence, these are some of the single intervention strategies that have been tried. So what do we mean by single intervention? So they did just one thing to see whether it would reduce falls, as opposed to a multifactorial intervention, which I'll share in a minute. So you can see that one of the ones that has done very well is Tai Chi. There are a lot of Tai Chi classes that are now happening out in our communities because the evidence shows that doing either Tai Chi or some sort of community-based balance strengthening exercise program reduces falls, and pretty significantly. The estimated risk reduction ranged between 29 and 49%, which is quite impressive, actually. Having professionally supervised exercise programs, specifically having physical therapy, also was effective. Thinking about discontinuing psychotropic medications was effective. And then modifying home hazards after hospitalization. Interestingly, there are no studies to date that show that modifying the home when you're not coming out of the hospital is as effective. But something about doing it when people are coming home from the hospital worked, but certainly not to the same level as exercise and the medication reduction. So in terms of multifactorial interventions, there are specific components that seem to work, and those are listed here. So again, it's not just review of medications, but it's reduction of things that are thought to be contributing to falls. It's the exercise piece. It's evaluating the blood pressure, which is undoubtedly tied to the medication reduction, and then the home hazard modification. Now, in terms of evidence, the evidence is pretty darn strong for some of our things and not so wonderful for others. And you can appreciate that the top three, again, the environment, the exercise, and the assessment of risk factors and management of same, have really strong evidence, but there's less evidence for some of those others. Now, I love to share a study that was done in England around cataract surgery. So what they did, which could only be done in a place like England, is they assigned women who needed cataract surgery to either get cataract surgery immediately or to have to wait a year. Now, you know, if we tried to do that in this country, we would have people who just went down the street and got their cataract surgery. But in England, they had more control. So they followed people post their surgery for a year and followed the control group for a year and compared the number of falls. And what they found was that there was a 34% reduction in falls in the group who had the cataract surgery done. So clearly, if you've got someone who's sitting on the fence and falls are an issue, it's probably worth encouraging them to go ahead and think about having cataract surgery. Not only will they be able to see better, but their risk of falls potentially may go down. The other interesting thing is when they did the second eye, it didn't matter. So it's having an eye that sees well that is important. The other thing you may have heard about is vitamin D supplementation. This is one of those that was controversial, then everybody was firmly convinced that we knew the evidence, and now we're back to nobody's really sure. But there had been very strong evidence for vitamin D supplementation, and it was more than or equal to 800 international units for people who had proven vitamin D deficiency. And so I know many of us in clinic are checking more regularly to see what people's vitamin D levels are, just in case that's a contributor. There is some evidence that if you suspect that they're deficient or they're at increased risk of falls and they're an older adult, that it's reasonable to start them on 800 IUs of vitamin D, recognizing that you just want to be careful in terms of not overdosing and using those lower dosings rather than the 50,000 that we use for those first few weeks after someone is newly diagnosed with deficiency. The thought in terms of why vitamin D supplementation might work is that vitamin D is a building block for muscle in addition to bone. And so the thought is that you're actually giving the muscle something that it needs, which helps make it stronger. Another question that I often get is around hip protectors. And there have been a couple of studies that were pooled together looking at, do hip protectors work? And what they were able to show in this Cochrane review is that in nursing homes, they were able to show a little bit of a reduction in hip fracture incidence. And I want you to pay attention to this number here. So while there was a 23% reduction in risk, it ranged between the 0.62 and 0.97, and you know when you get to 1, you've lost your significance. So it was there, but not super strong. Out in the community, no reduction in hip fracture. But the problem is compliance. So it may be that they work, but we can't get people to wear them, and here's the why. This is what hip protectors actually look like. So they are typically some sort of, to me they look like football pads, basically. So it's got some sort of a stretchy material, kind of like a girdle, and then it's got pads that are located over the greater trochanter, and these can be made of a hard plastic shell, or they can be made of thick padding material. And you wear them under your clothes, but of course what it means is that you add extra out in the hip area. And I can tell you that the majority of us do not want any extra out there, and so we have a hard time convincing people that they ought to wear them. Whereas in the nursing home, if someone puts the pads on a resident, they're probably not going to object, and that may be why we see the difference. So one of our major challenge has been the dissemination of this evidence. So we have a lot of evidence around how to reduce falls, but trying to get it out into the lay public has been a real challenge. And there was a study that I was lucky enough to be part of up in Connecticut. And what we did was compared the rate of falls with 2 different areas of Connecticut, and the goal was to try and disseminate fall prevention information across this population. So let me first show you where the Connecticut Collaborative was. So our intervention group was in this area here. Hartford is kind of in the middle here. And then our usual care was down the coast, and Yale is up in this area. And we did not do anything in the middle here, and the reason for that is that we found that there was a lot of overlap, and people would use both Hartford and Yale, and so did not want to taint the data. So what did we do? It was massive. It was a practice change intervention, so the pharmaceutical companies were the ones who really pilot tested a lot of this for us. So it was media attention, it was seminars, it was a website that people could go to that gave them information. We advertised on buses to increase awareness about this fall prevention activity. and then did these outreach visits where evidence-based information about fall-related practice was shared with physicians, with physical therapy, with nurses, with hospital folks, with ED docs. So anybody that we could talk to, we talked to. And what we were looking at is serious illness reduction. So before the intervention, the adjusted rate of serious fall-related injuries per 1,000 people, you can see, is pretty similar in both usual care and in the intervention group. And then during the evaluation period, you can see that the usual care group stayed about the same as what they'd been, but the intervention region actually did go down. And that adjusted rate ratio is 0.91, so about a 9% difference. And that was statistically significant. And in terms of use of medical services, so number of people who were actually coming for fall-related issues, increased in the usual care group from 68 to 83, and also increased in the intervention group from roughly 71 to 74. But when you compared the two groups, again, we had about an 11% difference between usual care and intervention, and was focused on intervention being better, lower specifically. So what does that mean in English, right? So the rate of serious fall-related injuries was 9% lower than usual care. The adjusted rate of use of medical services was 11% lower. And importantly, this difference stuck around even after we finished the intervention and we finished the evaluation. These numbers remained consistent, which is exciting. But here's the really important part. That 11% reduction in use of services translates to 1,800 fewer emergency department visits or hospital admissions. And from a savings perspective, it's about $12,000 per event, which calculated out to be about $21 million in healthcare costs, based on average costs for falls. So again, from a societal perspective, that's a big impact. That's a public health sort of intervention. And not surprisingly, there is definitely public health interest. So the WHO created a fall prevention model that talks about awareness, assessment, and interventions in the community, things that we can be encouraging to happen to lower falls. And the CDC has developed a huge number of